we have some resolutions from the floor. So I'll go to you, Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and colleagues. So these are two additional recommendations, and I suppose where I have a view on this is that these matters are sufficiently important, and we've sort of shifted from forum to forum to forum on them, that we do actually need to, as a council, give some direction around where we want to go here, and that direction is best to come here from a council meeting rather than to continue to sit in workshops and other behind the scenes processes. So we've got two recommendations here. The first, the chief executive report back on the feasibility. So noting this is just a feasibility report, the city council becoming carbon neutral by 2030, and for that to inform the long-term plan. And secondly, that the chief executive includes an annual carbon emissions forecast in the draft long-term plan with emissions reducing annually. So I'll just speak to those briefly in turn. First, around the feasibility, we're very much at the point in our climate change journey where we do need to be assessing what our future outlook is there. We hear regularly from the community and in submissions around a desire for us to be more ambitious in terms of our response. And this is simply, again, asking that feasibility of question of how feasible that might be. This is, of course, also well supported by the science that's out there and continuing to strengthen around the 2020s being the decade where we do need to act decisively to cut emissions. And so there's good precedent around this both in New Zealand and elsewhere, with councils being on this sort of trajectory around 2030. And I think that we should ask ourselves if we might be in a position to join them. So again, this recommendation simply puts the question, is it feasible for us to be carbon neutral by 2030? Getting the response to that question will allow us to tease out some of the options around that, understand what some of the co-benefits might be, whether we might use offsets as an interim solution, et cetera, et cetera. Probably fair to say that 2030 does sound ambitious, and I think that that's reasonable at a feasibility stage, that we should be ambitious and shape from there. So I'd encourage you to wholeheartedly support this first recommendation as an appropriate next step in our response around climate change. To the second recommendation on the screen, the one number 3, really just noting that our emissions have very much been traveling in the right direction, but we have yet to really get into the hard yards. As we've seen, we've sort of picked the low-hanging fruit so far, which is absolutely fantastic. But going forward, we do need a solid multi-year plan, and I think we need to be able to communicate that plan clearly to the community in terms of what they might expect for their investment in the future in terms of an emissions forecast. We have the basic inputs into this through our asset management plans and budgets coming in to inform the long-term plan. And this is simply to make sure that we have an explicit forecast there around what our expected annual emissions would be coming out of that plan should we sign it off. My view is that we need to have that as an input into the plan rather than waiting for it to fall out of the plan at the end, because I think there will be significant community interest in this, as is only right and given the times that we live in. Note that I am just referring to it as a forecast rather than a budget as such. I think it would be inappropriate to lock it down and start to call it a budget. It is simply to try to understand what that trajectory of emissions will be over the next 10 years. So I'd urge you as well to vote in favor of this recommendation. I think it deserves strong support as a good sound basis for decision making in the long-term plan, and a good example in terms of our operations with the community around planning, transparency, and accountability in terms of climate change. I think yes votes on both of these will strengthen our LTP process and our engagement with the community on these matters. Thank you.
Before I open it up, Councillor Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm happy to support these two recommendations today. I'm aware that resources are currently quite stretched, and so I think referring these through to the long-term plan is the appropriate place to have these discussions. I guess for the first recommendation, or labelled recommendation 2, I think that we need to be aware of the implications of bringing forward our carbon neutral targets. including the work programs and costs associated with those, and looking at the wider work program. Can we afford to prioritise this? Can we afford not to prioritise this? We just don't know. And so I think actually looking at that alongside the long-term plan is the most sensible place for that discussion to have. In regards to the forecasting, we've had discussions around, when we make decisions, we've got this little chart that we look at whether things are budgeted for, the implications of making those decisions, whether we're authorised to make that decision. And I think it's going to be really useful to actually also have some forecasting of our carbon emissions to consider that alongside decision making to ensure that we are meeting goals that we have set ourselves. So both of these are obviously just looking at bringing them into the wider picture of the long-term plan and not requesting any specific decisions be made on timelines or anything at this stage.
All right, councillors, I'll open it up for any comments, and I'll start. I'm rather disturbed that we're having this quite ad hoc discussion. It was brought to me at 7 o'clock last night by the two chairs, and I'm disappointed that it came in that way. It is ad hoc. It's strange how it's being brought up at this time, and I would have to say that the discussion, we're on a path, and we need to continue that, and this discussion is at the long-term plan. Just to give you an understanding, number one is massively changing our targets, and it's bringing it forward basically to 9 years. Now, if we want to do that, the right place to do that is having all the information, all the costs in front of you. We can't do that on the fly here now. I know it's about bringing a report back. We probably won't get it's a massive amount of work too. So you might get the report when the long-term plan is about to, or might even past. So number three is, I think, again, somewhat similar to the solar report. We'll waste some more money to find out what we already know. So I'm sorry, I don't support these at all, and I'm not happy at the way they've been brought forward. And I've spoken to one of the chairs, and I'll be speaking to the other one later. Everyone's entitled to bring things forward, but this is quite a massive, this has massive repercussions. Do I support some of the end goals of this? Absolutely, but we've got to have that informed discussion, and we're having it on an ad hoc. Let's do it on the fly because it's the right time to do it. I don't agree with that. The right time to do that is at the LTP. So I strongly advise you not to support these. They're very ad hoc, and yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Any other comments? Councillor Happer.
It was just a question to the Chief Executive. Just an indicative, if you can give us an indicative cost around what these two recommendations would cost us. It would be really, really helpful.
I really can't give you that. We haven't really done the work on what this would be. As you can imagine, we haven't really had any warning of this. But can I just say that the council has set us a really challenging budget for the year. We said at the time that it was approved, and you asked me about whether I could implement that budget. And I did say that it was going to be extremely challenging. And we do not have wriggle room. We are very challenged in our budget right now, and that is putting an enormous amount of pressure on staff to meet the expectations of council and the city. And I did say at the time that we would not have wriggle room to just put ad hoc work in. This is a massive amount of work. It's not just a small piece to give it the degree of credibility that it will need to come back by officers. What we were intending to do anyway was to bring something to the LPDP discussions around putting in place a budget to do this first recommendation, so to actually put money in the first year so that we could actually do this report and prepare us properly. We've already done our and completed our asset plans, so we would need to go back in time for this LTP and review all of those. Again, a massive piece of work. So it is substantial.
Just in light of that comment, I will not be supporting this. I appreciate the intent of the recommendations put forward by the mover and seconder, but I won't be supporting these recommendations at this time, but look forward to what's coming to the LTP and look forward to supporting them through the LTP process. But thanks very much for the mover and seconder for putting these forward at this time.
Any further comment? Oh, Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I believe that the LTP process is the appropriate place to consider this, but the better informed we are about the decisions around LTP that we make during the LTP, the better. And I guess I probably have a slightly different view to the Mayor on this, because I think the councillors who've put this forward, I guess, are indicating that it would be good for us to be well informed in our LTP discussions about what it would take to achieve that. That doesn't necessarily lock us into any decisions during the LTP, but I believe that having that information for us to consider during the LTP would be really beneficial. So I'll be supporting this.
Councillor Johnson.
Yes, I mean, I can see where this is coming from, but I'm slightly, a bit like some others, slightly bemused by the process. 3 years ago, we set a target of 25% reduction in emissions by 2028. I'm not sure where this concept of being carbon neutral by 2030 has come from. I mean, there's a national target for the country to be carbon neutral by 2050. So I'm just not seeing where this has come from, I suppose. And I feel that it's a bit of a leap from 25% reduction in emissions in the 10-year plan that we set up 3 years ago by 2028 to zero carbon neutral by 2030. And the cost of this, let me tell you, if you haven't worked out, would be huge, absolutely huge. So I'm not sure that I can support an extra report, which would be a big report, coming back to tell us something which we know would be financially not achievable with all the other things that we've got to do in the next few years. Secondly, councillors, remind you, and you'll be tired of me by the end of this year, that I warned you all when you decided to vote on a reduced budget this year that you'd be regretting it all year. And here we are again in a situation where some councillors would like additional work done. There isn't that room in the budget. I won't mention library books. But seriously, you know, the decision was made by a majority that we would have a very tight budget this financial year. And there are consequences to that. And one of them is that you can't ask for very workload intense reports to be produced in a very short time frame. So although I support us having progressive reductions in our carbon emissions, and I support us having achievable targets, I'm not sure where this has come from, and I'm not going to support it at this time.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And Councillor Johnson has pretty much said what I was going to say. These recommendations have significant costs, and they should go through we're putting the cart before the horse. We should put the feasibility in the first year of the long-term plan where we've got the costs, because councillors, you may not be aware that feasibilities can be from $10,000 to $100,000 to $200,000 depending on what you're asking for. And I haven't got those figures in front of me to be able to say yes or no. So the correct process to me would be to put a feasibility figure in the first year, look at the outcome of that feasibility, and I agree with Councillor Johnson, you are looking at significant costs depending on your forecasts of these targets. So then you go out, then you can go out to our public and then get their feedback through the long-term plan of how they see us in progressing this. So I will be not supporting this today.
Okay. No, the councillor's back to you for right a reply on both of them. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to colleagues for commenting on this and raising a number of interesting points. The first one, I do feel that I need to set the record straight around sort of correspondence around this, and many of you will recall correspondence prior to the Environmental Sustainability Committee where this recommendation first sat, and would want to first acknowledge that the mayor's inbox is an incredibly busy space, but that there was communication with the mayor at that point around this proposal and a subsequent request for a meeting. So there has been efforts to engage with elected members, including the mayor, around this, but do acknowledge that, as I said, there's a busy inbox there, and it's possibly not an intentional gap in communication, but clearly has been perceived as such by the mayor. A lot of the arguments here have come down around process and when the right point in the process is, and I guess the reason to bring this forward at this time, again, is to make sure that the next substantial process that we're involved with, which is the long-term plan, is as well informed as can possibly be. And I suppose reflecting on where this conversation has been over the last 12 months at council, there's been often encouragement to, wait for the next committee meeting, wait for the next workshop, wait. And I feel that this is sufficiently important for our community that we move to a more active footing in this space and ensure that the decisions that we make are very, very, very well informed. Again, the reflections on the last long-term plan around that target setting of the 25% by 2028 was a very loose process, to say the least, and not strongly informed. Again, we deserve, and our community deserves, much more strongly informed decisions and process. Another reason to ensure that we support this decision at this time is that we live in a world where everything sort of gets shunted, and it all gets shunted to the long-term plan. It ends up being such a big kettle of fish, to use an analogy, that it's really, really hard to actually ensure that all the pieces are correctly in place. So again, important pieces of work, such as where we're going in terms of emissions, should have some consideration independent of that process to inform it in a more structured and clear way. A good question raised by Councillor Johnston and others in terms of where this has come from, how it sits vis-a-vis the Zero Carbon Act, et cetera. The information that we get from scientists continues to change and update on a regular basis. And really the impetus around this is that, the most recent information from a science point of view is that this decade is a very, very important decade. And so we want to see what is possible in that regard. And again, that's why it is a feasibility question, just to simply ask, is it possible? So if you even think about the science that went into informing the zero carbon bill, and as that worked through Parliament in the last 3 years, that has since been updated substantially in terms of the timeframes and the necessity that we have in front of all of us, including here at this table, to get on top of our emissions as rapidly as possible. I suppose the other reason to defend a more ambitious target such as 2030 is that councils do have a role of leadership in their communities. And I feel that for us as a council, we should be leading in this space. Other councils are already in this space or ahead. There's a council just down the coast from us that is well on track to be carbon neutral by 2025. So again, our role in the community as leaders, to my mind, is a sufficient justification that we should be supporting looking at what is feasible in terms of being carbon neutral by 2030 and ensuring that the long-term plan is well informed with forecasts around our emissions. So I'd urge you to support both of these recommendations, and I'd ask that we take them separately.
All right, councillors. fine with that? Separately, please. So we will vote on number 2 first. And that has failed for and 12 against. Right, we'll now go to number 3. And that has also failed for and 12 against. Right, councillors, we'll move on now to number 9, which is the report around the District Licensing Committee, the appointment process, and there's a memo there from our legal counsel, Desiree Harvey. It's on page 89 of your papers. And Desiree, we'll take it as being read, but is there, you want to summarise on anything there?
No, I'm fine with it. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Councillor Dingwell.
On page 90, number 2.4, it talks about the criteria for being on this. What would happen if we had no elected members with experience of the alcohol industry? Or if they did, but they had a conflict of interest?
This has, through you, Mr. Mayor, this has been dealt with other councils that we have looked at and asked about, and there is a mechanism whereby you can have a district licensing committee without elected members, and that would be by appointing commissioners who are external people who fit in with these requirements and sit on other councils and other committees. So that would be what we would look to do if we needed to.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Are there any other questions of Desiree? There being none, thank you, Desiree. Right, we have the recommendations there 1 to 4, and I'm quite happy to move those. If I could have a seconder. Thank you, Councillor Dennison. I'll open it up for any comments. There being none, can you vote, please? Councillor Barrett. And that is passed 14-4 and 2 abstentions. Thank you. Right, we move on to number 10, which is an update on the release of our Part 2 decisions. And there's a memo there on page 93 from our governance manager, Hannah White. And Hannah, as others, take it as being read, but is there any summary you want to put to it?
I think it's a bit of good news to be able to tell you we're up to date with the training. We looked at the last training and brought a report to you in March for 2016 through 2019. we are now presenting to you everything from February through to June this year, and subject to resolution today, we'll be able to bring you potentially 2 more for the period from June to September to the October council meeting.
Great, excellent. I'll open it up for any questions. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Hannah. I appreciate the work that's been done in this space. Just looking at page 94 under 3.1, the process going forward, and those first 2 bullet points talk about the recommendations that are in the Part 2 reports about when the decisional report can be released. And the second bullet point talks about that are, the decisions that are resolved by council to be released. I guess the thing that I'm asking is when those recommendations about when the reports will be released are contained in Part 2 reports, they're not actually voted on at the moment. They just sit there, and it's always seemed a little bit strange to me because the council isn't making a decision unless it votes on. So going forward, is that practice going to change, and will we actually vote on those recommendations?
Actually, we've already changed it. This year we have started to do that.
So the recommendations are in the report, but I don't think we've ever voted on the recommendation as to when the reports will be released.
Yes,
is the part that I'm talking
about. Started to it this year. So you notice, so when you look at the front page of the confidential decision today, when we move into Part 2, you'll notice that there's a recommendation statement around when and how, but then actually in what the council resolves, there's a second statement to resolve that. So that's there now.
So that hasn't happened up till now, though, has it?
Recently, in the last few months, we've been doing that.
Yeah, it has, Councillor.
Oh,
You probably just haven't noticed it.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions of Hannah? Renee. Oh, sorry, Councillor Dingwell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Hannah. So on page, so often when we report about, decisions made in council, we record who voted for and who voted against, and that information isn't available in this summary. Is it available on the website?
I might just have to ask my colleague who's been putting things up on the website, but my understanding is that the website is, on the page on the website where the decision is released, it's referring, we either release the full report or we release the decision. But I'm just going to ask Sarah to speak to that because I don't have the detail. Because that discussion happened in the Part 2 and the minutes themselves are not being released, then the results of the voting is not released either.
So I guess, so with this second recommendation, would that make this process a bit more transparent for just in terms of knowing who voted for and who voted against each of these things, or is it just because it's confidential, it's always going to be confidential how we voted?
Could you rephrase your question just while I think about how I might answer it?
So I'm just thinking about how the public would know who voted for each of these things that we've got being released at the moment without having to go through specific reports to find that information.
At this stage, they wouldn't know that. So they would know that the council as a whole made a decision one way or another, but who voted which way and the division of that is not currently part of the process we're considering today.
Okay, I might leave that there. Thank you.
All right, councillors, anything else? Councillor Barrett?
Thank you. Just following up on that interesting line of questioning. I mean, is there anything that would prevent us making a decision to include the vote in the information that was released? Like, is it prohibited by law?
I would have to go back and do some work on that and see what some of the potential risks might be around that. I'm not aware of anything that would prohibit us doing it, but I think we would need to consider what some of the potential implications might be.
So I guess to follow up then, if a recommendation were to come that requested that the voting records be released unless there is a legal or other reason to not do it, would that give you reasonable direction and flexibility?
I think we could consider that now without necessarily having direction to do so. And then if there was something that we felt the council need to make a decision on, we could bring that back to you.
So I guess not to drag out too much, but just by considering it, what's that likely to lead to in the absence of direction?
Well, Councillor, if I could interrupt, I think the officers said that she would bring back something to us. We can put it on the work schedule. We could do something.
Yeah, if it's already on the work schedule. Or
no, I didn't say it was on the work schedule.
If it's able to get on the work schedule, that'll be fine. Thank you. No further questions, Mr.
No,
Mayor.
it seems we've been trumped. So we have a resolution, an additional resolution that the voting decisions are also released for Part 2 items when the decision report is released. That's from Councillor Naylor and seconded by Councillor Dingwell. I'm uncomfortable doing that until we get some advice, but that's just my personal opinion. I'll just get the CEO to just on that additional resolution, just give us a bit of advice.
I think we would need a recommendation from this committee to bring back some advice to the next council meeting. I see Hannah nodding, so if a councillor wishes to put that up.
Okay, apparently we've just amended the additional recommendation. We'll just wait for it to come back. Okay, so councillors, we've got are the mover and the seconder of number 3, the additional one. Are you okay to take them all as a group, or does people want to take them separately? Councillor Dennison?
Mr. Mayor, if I can ask that that additional recommendation around the voting be taken separately, and I'd like to speak.
All right. Okay. Well, number 1 and number 2, I'll look to move those. Seconded by the Deputy Mayor, and that cleans that up. So 1 and 2 moved by the Mayor, seconded by Deputy Mayor. And let's deal to those first, because I do think that's relatively straightforward. So any further comments on those? I'd just like to make a comment to say thank you to the officers. This is good work, and to think that we're right up to date is really good, and I think it's just a good process. So the word transparency has been thrown around by a few elected members, and I think that's very transparent. So thank you to the officers. And if no further comments, we'll vote. Thank you. And it's passed 16 votes for and none against. Right, we'll move to number 3, and that's around, if we could just have that separately, please. The voting decisions that are also released for Part 2 items when the decision report is released, subject to legal advice. And so, Councillor Naylor, do you wish to speak to that?
Thank you. And I'd just like to say I do really appreciate the work that's been done in this area, and I really see this as just a small refinement of that. I think the intent behind this work has always been for our decision-making process to be as transparent as possible, and there are good reasons why things need to be discussed in Part 2, and those reasons are described in the Legoima Act. But once those decisions are released, I think there's no reason why the process shouldn't be as much as similar in terms of the transparency and accountability as what we demonstrate during Part 1. In Part 1, the public can read the minutes and they can get that information. It's probably not appropriate for the full minutes of Part 2 to be released because it may include items that have been released as well as items that haven't yet been released. So that would be a complicating issue. So I think this is the most straightforward way to, when that item is released, to release it in its entirety as much as possible. And I think that includes the way that elected members have voted.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am very strongly opposed to this, to support something with even out the legal advice. This is putting it subject to, but even with the advice, I have my reservations. When you say there's no reason to keep it not released, there's one fundamental reason that I think is clear, is that when you put the arguments of who voted for and against, no member can ask that member, or they can ask, why do you vote that way? But you're putting at risk the information that's still held in Part 2 to justify your decisions in the argument, which could expose the council to further risk. I raised, when this issue first came up around the transparency and wanting to bring everything for the wider public and for their good, the issues around risk. And I think we need to take our responsibility seriously of just what some of the issues that we do need to give direction on in a Part 2 setting, which are highly sensitive around personal privacy, commercial exposure, and cost figures with many zeros behind them. And if we can't justify our position on how we vote, well, therefore, I don't believe we should disclose that record accordingly. This whole argument around transparency is one I bring back to the issue of trust. We've been elected with an element of trust to make these decisions wisely, prudently, taking into consideration the legal implications, the engineering expertise, some of the public viewpoint where we can on those issues, and the financial implications, and many other issues. And to not have the benefit to actually explain that rationale to a member of the public or to the media why you took that certain stance, I think is very unfortunate and very unfair. And so I come back to this position of trust. If the members can't trust us to make those types of decisions in a well-considered, appropriate way, well, then vote us out. Vote us out. But that's really the bottom line. I'm here on the basis of having a high degree of trust that I can make those decisions appropriately for the wider good of the community. So it's an issue around trust. It's an issue around protecting the risk to this council and this city. It's around an issue of fairness for members to be able to explain why they voted, not just the record of how they voted, but why they voted. It's a big difference. And we're making this recommendation on the fly. You talk about making decisions on the fly. Man, this is one of them. And I don't think people realise the type of implications this could open us up to. So I think this is a very clear, very real position, and I think you need to consider this wisely before you just cast your vote for or against, because this is serious stuff, and I don't want to make the whole lightweight issue. I'm putting emphasis, this is serious stuff, and make sure you put your vote in the right direction. Thanks.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think the default position should be that the voting record, as a matter of course, should be transparent, but I'm not comfortable that this decision would proceed subject to legal advice. I think it's around the wrong way. So I will move a procedural motion that this matter lie on the table until the next council meeting so that legal advice can be provided before the vote is taken on this matter.
And it's seconded by Councillor Rutherford. So I'll now ask you to vote. Just a technical, we're just getting things sorted. All right, councillors, if you could vote on the procedural motion, please.
Sorry, point of order. Mr. Mayor, just to clarify that in having this matter lie on the table, alongside that will need to be the legal advice coming beforehand. So that doesn't necessarily have to be in the motion, but it needs to be captured by officers.
Officers understand. All right. If we could vote, please, on the procedural motion, yeah. And that is passed, 15 votes for and 1 against. All right, we now move on to number 11, which is an amendment to our council and committee meeting schedule for 2020. There's a short memo there on page 101 from our governance manager, Hannah White. Again, take that as being read, Hannah, but anything else to add?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to note that we need to make a small change to...
Sorry, could you speak up?
Sorry, just to note that we need to make a small change to recommendation 2 in the report because we'll be back in the chamber. So the recommendation that's in the report is noting that we'd be at the function and conference centre, but we'd like to change that back to the chamber, please.
Great, thank you. All right, councillors, this is relatively straightforward, just a bit of process. So we have the 4 recommendations there. One that we received the report, the second that Rangatane on Manawatu meeting be on the 25th of November, back into the chamber, that the Manawatu District and Pastoral City Joint Strategic Committee will meet at the 10th of November at the MDC chambers, and that the Play, Rec and Sport Committee on the 21st of October will be held at the Central Energy Trust Arena at 2 p.m. And I'm looking forward to moving those, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Is there any questions or comments of that? There being none, let's vote. Councillor Dingwall. It's passed. 16 votes for, none against. Thank you. We now just move to our council work schedule on page 100 and it's actually 106, I think. Yes. And I'll look to move that. Second by the Deputy Mayor. I'll open it up for any matters arising in questions. Councillor Naylor.
I'm just wondering if the 2021 meeting calendar will be included in the next month's agenda.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, that is the intention.
Okay. Any other comments? Being none, could we vote, please? It's passed. 16 votes for, none against. We'll now look to move into part 2. So that the public be excluded, and the list of reasons there are on page 5. I'll look to move that, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. No comments, questions towards that? Okay, we will vote. It has passed. 16 votes for and none against. Right, we'll just